What is going on, everyone? My name is Andy. Welcome back to another FPL video. In this one, we're going to go through some of your team selections for game week 1. And we're also going to look at the data from 583 teams from Twitter to see how the template is lining up there versus the overall ownership on the FPL website. Thanks to Sivert for helping me collect that data. If you haven't already followed him, make sure you do. There is a link in the description below. He also runs the FPL Optimized podcast, which is well worth a listen. And obviously, we have just over 24 hours to go until the deadline by the time this video comes out. Plenty of time to get signed up to Fantasy Football Hub. Still up to 50% off there, and if you sign up and don't win your mini league, you can get your money back. Terms and conditions apply. All the links you need are in the description below. So we'll start with the top 10 most owned players from the 583 teams that we looked at on Twitter, and I know that's a much smaller sample size than the 6 million people that are signed up on the FPL site, but you would have to consider the overall player base is probably a little bit less engaged than those of us on YouTube and Twitter. And so it's always interesting to see the difference in ownership levels. So as you might imagine, the top player is Haaland, 93.1%. That has dropped from about 98% last time I did this from about 600 teams, which is interesting. Maybe it's because he's blanked 6 times in a row for Man City, didn't get anything in the Community Shield. Perhaps that's putting people off a little bit. Either way, massively owned. Estepinian is 92.3%. He's in my team. I think the first 3 fixtures are excellent. You can then decide what to do with him after that. I think if you have to play him against Newcastle and Bournemouth, not a problem. If you've got a spare transfer to move him on, happy days. Saka is 90.7%. Gabriel is 82.2%, so much higher owned than the likes of Saliba. I still get the odd comment about why that is. It's just the goal threat. In terms of minutes, I think they're both pretty secure. I guess Saliba is maybe slightly more at risk from someone like Timber because he could play on the right, Ben White could play right centre-back, but I think that partnership with Saliba and Gabriel is pretty solid. They're not really going to miss many games when they're kind of fit and available. Rashford is 74.1%, so last time I did this, him and Fernandes were quite close. There is now a bit of a gap. Fernandes is 55.4%. Chilwell, huge ownership here, 62.4%. He's only around 15% on the FPL site. So people are kind of ready for those attacking returns, ready for those fixtures that Chelsea have from kind of game weeks 2 and 3 onwards. The biggest mover is João Pedro. He's now 59% owned in terms of the Twitter template. That's massive for good reason. 5.5 million on penalties. Great opening fixtures for Brighton. There's obviously question marks around his minutes because the amount of options they've got. We still don't know whether they're going to buy Kudus as well. That's kind of gone a little bit quiet. We know the transfer window is obviously open past game week 1. But I think there's not much. You can't really go wrong with João Pedro early on. Like, he might become an issue after kind of 3-4 game weeks, but as long as you've got a plan in how you would upgrade him or how you would change him to someone else, I don't think that's a huge issue. Areola is 57% owned here. Now, I will say we took these teams before Matt Turner was changed to be playing for Nottingham Forest and FPL. All those Areola owners will switch to Turner. I'm absolutely sure of that. So he will then be in the top 10. And then it's Mubama at 51%. Now, that is probably a bit more of an interesting discussion than you would think, because if he doesn't get minutes, he is the kind of player that will fall in price. So there's maybe an argument that you should go for a dud 4.5 million forward instead, and so you don't risk that drop in value. It's a difficult one because if Mubama plays, then you definitely want him in your team. Like, having a 4.5 million forward that plays on the bench is great for FPL, but there's no guarantee of that. Also, I saw last night that West Ham are apparently in for Balogun from Arsenal. Now, that would give us a different 4.5 million forward, but it's probably not going to happen before the game week 1 deadline. And if you're on triple Arsenal, you can't put Balogun in, so it would be someone that will come in later. But if he was first choice, that is someone that's going to be worth a transfer later on anyway. So I wouldn't be too concerned. Right now, I'm still on Mubama, but I guess you could make a case to go someone a lot less owned because you're going to have them third bench anyway, and you don't want that drop in value. So we'll take a quick look at the rest of the top 20. Interestingly, number 11 and 12 are both £4 million defenders. So you've got Kabori at 41.9% and Bulldog at 39.5%. They are my favourite 2 £4 million defenders as well, because they should both play as wing-backs and both be fairly nailed. There is some talk that Bulldog might lose his place at some point to Bogle, but I think for the start of the season, he is perfectly fine to go for. And I suspect that a lot of people on Twitter will go with 2 £4 million defenders just to have extra money to spend elsewhere. I'm still undecided about whether or not I think that is a good move. I will probably land with 1.4 and 1.4.5 just for a bit of extra security, but there's nothing wrong with going for both of those players if you want to. Salah has creeped up. Last video I did, he wasn't even in the top 20, and Darwin Nunez was. He's fallen right down now that he's not got starts in the last 2 Liverpool games. Salah is at 39.3%. I actually think in terms of engaged managers, and by that I mean people that kind of watch YouTube videos, they interact on Twitter, I think that will go up before the deadline because there will be a last minute panic about not having the greatest FPL player ever. I know Haaland could take that mantle if he continues like he did last year, but Salah has had like 230 plus points in each of the last 6 seasons. You got that Bournemouth at home fixture in game week 2. There's a lot of reason to like him. As it stands, I still don't own him. Someone asked me on WhatsApp yesterday, like, what are the chances of me going for Salah, or how close am I? And I said, not close enough where I think it's likely that I do it. Sometimes you kind of know a move's going to happen, you just haven't, fully confirmed it yet. But with Salah, I don't know, I'm still leaning towards not going with him, but that ownership has creeped up and it will continue to go up. Stones is the most popular Man City defender, 37%. Don't hate that whatsoever, should be fine for the first few weeks. Martinelli, 34%. Onana, 34%. The most popular goalkeeper apart from Areola. No other goalkeeper makes the top 20, so Onana is definitely clear in that regard. Watkins, 31%. That's obviously gone up because of the injuries to Jesus and Nkunku. Eze, the most popular 6.5 million midfielder, 31.4%, ahead of Mbeumo, ahead of Mitoma as well. That is different on the FPL site where Mitoma is top, then Mbeumo, and then it's Eze, I think. So Eze is the most popular in terms of the Twitter community. Mitoma just behind him, by the way, at 29.2%. And then Maddison has creeped up to 26.1%. He was much lower last time we did this. And I think some of that is probably because it started to look like Kane was going to stay. But just before I started recording this video, David Ornstein tweeted to say that Bayern have reached agreement with Spurs and now Kane has to make a decision. Now, it still means he might stay, but that's the first time Spurs have accepted an offer for Harry Kane. So at this point, it does look more likely he could probably go, because if he wants trophies, Bayern is going to be a better place to do that than Spurs. So it'll be interesting to see. I think for me, no Kane probably makes Maddison a worse option, because obviously you haven't got that elite striker that you're kind of delivering all those assists to. But who gets penalties if Kane goes? Is it Richarlison? Is it Son? Is it Maddison? Maddison did start taking a few at Leicester kind of last season, so he might get penalties, which could make him a better option. I think they'll probably go to Son for what it's worth, but I suspect we'll see that Maddison ownership drop because there are now going to be concerns about Kane. The only way I wouldn't have those concerns is if he or Spurs come out before the game week 1 deadline and just say it's not going to happen. But at this point, I don't think we're going to get that assurance, and so I would probably ignore Kane, and I would probably say it makes Maddison slightly worse, although it's not a complete deal breaker. So just to go through some other players that I thought were interesting, behind Areola and Onana, Sam Johnson is the next most popular goalkeeper at 22.4%. I think there's a few reasons for that. One, people want to back the Palace defence over the Everton one, which I completely get. Flekken hasn't necessarily impressed during pre-season either. Now, for what it's worth, I think that's being overblown. Like, if you want to back the Brentford defence, Flekken is a perfectly fine choice. But I get why people are looking at Johnston. But also, I think Roy Hodgson came out and said that Guaita wants to leave. Now, whether or not that will happen, we don't know. But if you thought there was competition between those two for the number 1 shirt, it doesn't seem to be there. So Johnson is almost certainly going to start the season as Palace's number 1. In terms of 6.5 million midfielders, Mbeumo is the third most popular at 20.8%. Nicholas Jackson is 17.2%. Udogie, Spurs fullback for 4.5 million, much more popular than he was last time, 15.3%. I quite like him. I think he covers some of the bad fixtures for the popular defenders like Estepinian, for example, quite well. I do have question marks over how good the Spurs defence will be. Like with Postecoglou in charge, if I'm betting on whether Spurs will be much better in attack or defence, I think it's going to be the attack. They have signed a new centre-back now, so that will definitely help. But there's maybe a few more question marks over the defence, like I said, than how many goals they're going to go and score. But for 4.5 million, considering there's not a huge amount of standout options, I don't mind that pick, and he may well make my game week team as well, game week 1 team as well. Odegaard is 13%. Trent Alexander-Arnold When we checked teams right at the start of pre-season, he was in so many. Now he's 6.3%. I said on stream yesterday, if I'm going to go for a Liverpool player, it's almost certainly going to be Salah. I've pretty much ruled Trent out now. You can never completely rule out a last-minute panic and a last-minute change, but I don't think I'm going to go for Trent. And like I said, I have pretty much ruled him out, even though I'm not ruling out any last-minute changes, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. I've seen a few people talk about Garnacho. He's 2.9%. I think there's a good chance he starts in game week 1, possibly even the first 2 to 3 game weeks if Rasmus Højlund is going to be out. But there's no guarantee that Rashford won't start on the left and Sancho or Martial if they're fit and available through the middle. So I just don't think it's worth using a spot on Garnacho personally, especially if you're looking at like Onana, Rashford and Fernandes. He's not so good that I would drop one of those. Darwin, who was in the top 20 last time, 2.9%. You just cannot go for him. He hasn't started either of the last 2 friendlies. His minutes are too much of a concern. Trippier, second highest owned defender in FPL, is 1.37% in these Twitter teams for good reason. 3 of the first 4 opening fixtures are really tough. I would just have a plan to get him afterwards. And De Bruyne, less than 1% owned. That doesn't happen too often, 0.86%. I just think his minutes are too much of a concern first couple of game weeks. We may well get a leak for the Friday game, and if he's starting, that bodes well for the next few fixtures as well. But he's only had minutes in pre-season during that Community Shield game where he came off the bench. So I think for 10.5 million, I need more kind of or assurances, I should say, around minutes before I pick him. So just before we take a look at some of your teams, I thought I would show you this. I asked Sertout to come up with a Twitter template team based on ownership, but that was also affordable. And because he's such a good guy that you should follow, he was able to do that. So it's a 3-4-3 formation. It's a Nana in goal, Gabriel, Estepinian, Chilwell back 3. The midfield 4 is Martinelli, Saka, Fernandes and Rashford. And then up front it's Watkins, Haaland and João Pedro. He's really come into people's thinking over the last week. And then on the bench it's Areola, but that will definitely be Matt Turner by the time we get to the deadline. And then it's Baldock, Kabori and Anderson. It's actually got 1.5 million in the bank. So you could even upgrade that bench if you wanted to. Now that is a very strong team. It's template for a reason. I know that kind of frustrates people. They want to see loads of differences in how people set up for game week 1, but you've got to remember there's a lot of points on offer over the season. Even in the first couple of weeks, people will start making slightly different decisions. You're always going to have a core template of like 5 to 7 players. The best players will always kind of rise to the top in our thinking. But there are even ways to differentiate this. Like this is quite close to my current team, but I might end up with a different goalkeeper. I might go with a different bench player. I probably won't have João Pedro. Mitoma and Eze are the most popular 6.5 million midfielders. I'll probably have Mbeumo. I might not even have Watkins. I might go for Nicholas Jackson. So there are only like 3 to 5 moves that are different. But that's enough to kind of differentiate it for now. If the other players are template, but they're great picks, I'm still going to have them in my team. So the first team we're going to look at is a 3-5-2. You've got Johnston in goal, a back 3 of Stones, Estepinian and Gabriel. The midfield is Fernandes, Rashford and Saka with 2 differentials in Foden and Maddison. Up front it's Haaland and Nicholas Jackson. And then the bench is Areola, Reece James, Mubama and Baldock. And this team comes out of a 98% rating on the My Team tool on Fantasy Football Hub. If you want to check out your rating for your team before the game week 1 deadline, just click that link in the description below. It's completely free, and if you want to make use of the AI transfer suggestions, the Optastats, fixture analyzer, Ben Crellin's transfer planner, all that good stuff as well, you can sign up for one of their memberships with up to 50% off at the moment. All the links you need, like I said, description below. Just a few kind of things about this team, right? With Phil Foden, unless we get a leak that he's starting on Friday, I don't really see how we can go with him. It would be sod's law that after he didn't start in the Community Shield, he'll go and smash it against Burnley just after everyone's taken him out. But even if we get a leak that he's starting, and we probably will get some information about the Man City team, would you then be confident about him starting in game week 2? And game week 3 and game week 4 and so on? And don't get me wrong, there's loads of players you could move to instead of having Foden, but then you're kind of using a transfer straight away. So I just go back to that thing where I'm not sure he's that good. We have to include him as a minutes risk. And the main reason for that is so many other players are well priced. I've said this before, if Saka and Rashford, etc. are all like 9.5, 10 million, then maybe you take the risk on Foden. But for me, I'm not sure it's worth it. But obviously, if we do get that leak that he's starting and you want to risk it for the first few weeks, I've got no issue with that whatsoever. I've already mentioned Maddison a little bit. I do think if Kane goes, it makes him a slightly worse option, but I don't think he suddenly becomes awful. Obviously, it's better for him to have Son and Kane to be aiming for, but he scored really well the last couple of seasons at Leicester. His underlying numbers are still good. That team under Postecoglou is going to be more attacking. And even with Richarlison up front, I still think they'll do really well. So if you want to start with Maddison, no issues with that whatsoever. I do think part of the reason I'm not considering him more is because it feels like you're buying him for game week 3 onwards. And there's no harm in thinking long term, but there's also 2 game weeks before that. And look, Brentford away, Man United at home. Could Maddison return in both of those with set pieces and all that kind of stuff? Absolutely. But I feel like the real reason you have him is game week 3 onwards. And so, personally, I would prefer starting without him. But he's one of those players where I don't think he's a bad pick. Sometimes I see players in teams like Darwin Núñez. I would say that's a bad pick. He's not guaranteed to start. Maddison is a good pick. He's just not my preference. But you should obviously go with what you want to do. One thing I will say is Foden and Maddison are both 7.5 million. You could have a 6.5 million midfielder and then have Martinelli or Odegaard. And if you went for Martinelli, you'd have 0.5 to spend elsewhere. And that's where I know I'm coming back to my own team, but I find it difficult to say that Foden and Maddison is definitely a better combination. What I will leave it as, if they both start, they're great, and they could absolutely outscore the Arsenal and 6.5 million combination. I've already spoken about Nicholas Jackson. I think he's a perfectly good punt for game week 1 if you want to go for him. John Stones versus... the thing with John Stones is you get to start him ahead of a Chelsea defender, and he does have a better fixture in game week 1. I guess it is an away game. If a newly promoted side is ever going to be up for it and kind of, go for it against Man City, maybe this is the time. But ultimately, they are a great defence, so I like that pick as well. Just quickly on Reece James, I am considering for my own team having Chilwell and James, but I think if I was only going to have one, I'd go for Chilwell. And there's a few reasons for that. I've seen a bit of discussion over the last couple of days. One person pointed out, I think it was Luke, you might follow him, I think he's DIS_FPL on Twitter. I think he kind of said that very rarely these days do you see 2 fullbacks bombing forward. One usually stays behind and often forms that back 3. And if that's going to happen for Chelsea, it's almost certainly going to be Reece James that stays back and Chilwell that goes forward. So that is why, and also if you look at pre-season, that's kind of what's happened. Chilwell has been much more attacking down the left than Reece James has been down the right. Now, it might not work out like that once the Premier League starts, but I think I prefer to kind of go for Chilwell, who's on more set pieces as well, than going for Reece James. Like, don't get me wrong, if they're both given license to attack and they can both stay fit, then I would absolutely go for James. But I think everything for me right now is pointing towards Chilwell. Otherwise, the team is solid. So next is a 3-4-3 with a couple of interesting picks. You've got Onana in goal, Chilwell, Estupiñán and Gabriel back 3. The midfield is Eze. Alongside him is Bernardo Silva, very rarely mentioned in the 6.5 million midfielder conversation. So I'll talk about him in a minute. Martinelli and Maddison make up the final 2 spots. Then it's Watkins, Kane and Haaland up front. And the bench is Areola, Bayat and Baldock, so 2 £4 million defenders, and then Baptiste is the 4.5 million midfielder. Now, to be fair, this team was sent in before we got word that Bayern and Spurs had agreed a deal, so I suspect that Kane has already been taken out. But there's probably some of you thinking about going for him anyway, just in case he doesn't leave. The problem is, unless he or Spurs come out and say before the deadline he's definitely not going, there's a chance that it happens afterwards. So I think James from Planet FPL talked about this as well. We could get to the deadline at 6:30 UK time on Friday, not knowing whether he's staying or going. But before their game on Sunday, he might decide and then be taken out of the squad. And he's just not that good that it's worth it. And then suddenly you've got a transfer to make straight away. So I just wouldn't go with Kane unless he tweets that I'm definitely staying, looking forward to another season and stuff like that. Obviously with this setup, you could easily just switch Kane and your 4.5 million midfielder to a 4.5 million forward and Salah. So the rest of the structure could still work if you want to go for 2 premiums. Just on Bernardo Silva, I have got almost no interest in him whatsoever. One, he blocks a Man City spot. And I know in my own team right now, I only have Haaland. But at some point, I might want a defender. And if Grealish is still starting regularly, or Foden becomes an option, or Alvarez or someone like that, I might want that 3rd spot. I just don't think I would want Bernardo Silva. But also, one of the reasons that he's not that popular, if we take a look at the stats on Hub, you can see them for last year, and you can kind of configure this however you want. But I've got it per 90 minutes for midfielders only, and I'm going to put the price to just 6.5 million midfielders. And when you get this list, it suddenly doesn't look great for Bernardo Silva. If you order it by non-penalty expected goals per 90, he's right at the bottom of the list. 0.11. That is awful. There's defenders who are close to that, and I don't think we've seen anything so far in pre-season that tells me he's going to do much better. For example, Barnes, who's at Newcastle, bad fixtures to start, 0.36 per 90 minutes. Mitoma, 0.35. March, 0.34. You get the idea. They're all way ahead of Bernardo Silva. And even if you thought, well, he's quite creative, if I order it by expected assists, he's in the middle of the list at 0.17, but Eze, Mitoma, Gross, and Burmo and March are all ahead of him. So he just doesn't offer enough attacking threat. And there's so many other good 6.5s. He's one of the last ones that I would go for. Plus he plays for Man City, and I would prefer not to have that spot. So I'd go for Eze, Mitoma, and Burmo, March, even Harvey Barnes when Newcastle's fixtures get better is probably a better pick for me than Bernardo Silva. I could be biased there. Maybe it's previous experiences with him, whatever, but I just don't really rate him that much. So that's Kane and Bernardo Silva. Obviously, you've got no Man United attack here. No second Arsenal attacker either. That could hurt. They're obviously very popular, but if you prefer Watkins to a Fernandes or a Saka, etc., that's perfectly fine. I know they're not quite the same price, but they're close enough. Otherwise, I think the rest of the team is fine. There's question marks over whether you should go for two £4 million defenders, but if you're happy spending most of your transfers in your first 11 anyway, which most people are, it's not a huge issue because those two players are going to get plenty of minutes. I prefer Baldock and Kabori because they're both wing backs, but Bayer is absolutely nailed. And to be honest, the Burnley defence is probably going to be stronger than both Sheffield United and Luton as well. So if you're going to hope to nick the odd clean sheet, you're probably more likely to do it with Bayer. I guess just quickly, for anyone that is on a 3-4-3, if you're going to go for a midfielder, I'd probably choose someone else other than Baptiste. Maybe Anderson might get a few starts for Newcastle early on. The Canberra as well, absolutely nailed. Baptiste might be alright, but I feel like there's better options out there. One of which we're going to talk about in a minute, because Chelsea have a 4.5 million midfielder that may well start. And lastly, we got a 4-4-2 that has both Trent Alexander-Arnold and Mo Salah, two players that most of us would never consider going without, and yet this season some of us have got neither. So it is going to be interesting to see how the first few weeks go. Just to read out the rest of the team, it's Steele in goal, Chilwell, Trent, Gabriel, Botman back four, Eze, Martinelli, Fernandes, Salah midfield, then João Pedro and Haaland up front, and the bench is Turner, Chukwuemeka, I think I've pronounced that right, the 4.5 million midfielder for Chelsea, Baldock and Mubama, and the rating comes out at 91%. Now, I don't think this is a bad attempt at fitting in those two players, but I think that bench is pretty weak, and you're relying on having to play one of Botman, Chukwuemeka, Baldock or Mubama every single week, and straight away that doesn't sound great. I think if you want to keep Salah, there's two positions that could be downgraded to make the rest of the bench stronger, to give you more options. And that is either Trent down to someone like Estepinian, which I know is very template, but straight away you got 3 million to improve that bench, or you get rid of one of Fernandes or Martinelli down to a 6.5 million midfielder like Mitoma or Burmo alongside Eze, definitely not Bernardo Silva, and that would give you 1.5 to 2 million to spend, maybe to make Botman into a 5 or a 5.5 million defender, something like that. I don't think with this setup, personally, it works. Just on Chukwuemeka for Chelsea, potentially he could be an absolute bargain because Nkunku's injured, and so there's lots of predictions that he's going to play number 10. Couple of things about that. I guess it's not guaranteed over a long period of time, and also the transfer window is still open past game week 1. I would not put it past Chelsea to sign someone to play there, given Nkunku is out until December. So that would be a worry, but also he blocks a Chelsea spot. Now, some of you are probably thinking, we're all talking about Chelsea far too much. They weren't great last year. They've already got an injury to Nkunku. Even with the fixtures, they're not going to be great. You might be right and we might be wrong. But if we are right, you may want suddenly very quickly with Luton at home. Let's just quickly check the Chelsea fixtures to remind ourselves how good they are. Game week 3 onwards, Luton at home, Forest at home, Bournemouth away, Villa at home, Fulham away, Burnley away. Very good fixtures. And Chelsea do have potentially a lot of options. Chilwell, James, Colwill. If Kepa goes to Bayern Munich, Sanchez in goal, Jackson, even Sterling, right? If he does well early on, could be an option. He's only 7 million. And again, I know most people will think I'm talking absolute crazy. you know, Raheem Sterling, he hasn't been an option in FPL for a while. It could happen. Suddenly you've got 6 players you might be thinking about. Do you want to be stuck with one of their midfielders? And I think there are other 4.5 million options you could go for, but none of them I would want to play that regularly, and I don't feel like it enables enough in the team. So that would be my worry. Outside of that, if you haven't got Estepinian, I like Steele. I'm not sure about the double up this early on. I am a little bit worried about Verbruggen, but I don't think that's going to be an issue until most people wildcard. So if you want to go for Steele, perfectly fine. But obviously, if you put Estepinian in, you could go for Johnson, Flecken, Pickford, or Onana instead. But overall, yeah, I think João Pedro is probably someone we haven't talked a huge amount in this video. I like him. Very cheap. Penalties, great opening fixtures. Brighton are a very attacking team. He could easily come away with 3 to 5 goals first 3 game weeks and suddenly be close to 6 million. I just think the only thing I'd say about him is make sure you've got an exit plan. I prefer Saka to Martinelli, but again, if you haven't got 0.5 million to spend and you're trying to get Trent and Salah, you've got to make sacrifices. The last thing I'll say about Salah, if you're going to go for him, I feel like you've got to commit to captain him in game week 2. And I've said this a lot, but if you're not, what is the point in having him? The value in these premium players is captaincy. And because we don't have all the Arsenal and Man United enablers like we did last year, Odegaard 6.5, Rashford I think was 6, Martinelli was 6. If you want those same players, it's not quite so easy to afford Salah. And if you're not going to captain him in game week 2 against Bournemouth at home because you're too afraid of Haaland, then really what is the point of him being in your team? I think in seasons gone past, you could afford 2 or 3 premiums without necessarily always worrying about captaincy. I don't think it's the case this year. Obviously, at some point, it might be that Fernandes, Odegaard, Marseille are just not good options and we go a bit cheaper, then the conversation changes. But for game week 1, I don't think that's the case. And also, the 4.5 million defender here is Botman. Fixtures are awful game weeks 2 to 4. So then you've got to play one of those bench players. I just don't think it's worth it. I think either Trent, Martinelli, Fernandes or Salah has to go to enable more money elsewhere. Like I said, if you want to get your team rated for free, link in the description below. If you want to sign up for Fantasy Football Hub, 50% off at the moment. If you don't win your mini league, they will give you your money back. Terms and conditions apply. All the links you need for everything, including to follow Sertap, are in the description below. I'll catch you again soon.